Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood, Rumpelstiltskin, Beauty and the Beast. Just hearing the names of these classic fairy tales can conjure up powerful memories from our childhood. But the true origins of these tales are buried in the stacks and shelves, waiting for the right person to come along and seek out their mysteries. Our show, Once Upon a Time, might take you beyond happily ever after. But here, surrounded by all the great fairy tales, we journey back through time and history to discover what led to the creation of the stories we only thought we knew. Jealousy, vanity, and the glorification of youth. These traits have been immortalized time and time again in story, but none so strikingly as in the tale of Snow White. Journeying back to the time of ancient Greece, we find the legend of Chione, or in English, Snow Girl. Courted by gods and men alike, this young beauty made the mistake of comparing her own looks to those of the goddess Artemis. But when those boastful words reached the heavens, Artemis struck her down with an arrow. Then, over 1,000 years later, we find Snow White's first published inspiration in the story of the young slave. In this Italian fairy tale, Lisa, a beautiful maiden, falls into a magical coma and is preserved for many years in a crystal casket. One day, she is discovered and awakened by her aunt, but the older woman develops a jealous fury over Lisa's good looks, and so she hides her identity and forces her to work in the kitchen. One day, the uncle discovers that the young worker is his niece, and he drives his wicked wife from their home. Lisa is then given her choice of prince to marry, a happy ending to a truly despicable tale. But something that historians have begun to infer is that the Grimm's tale may have been inspired by the accounts of real women. One of these cases is Margarita von Waldeck, a beautiful German countess who had a terrible relationship with her stepmother, and at the age of 16 was sent from her home. Later, Margarita began a torrid love affair with Prince Philip II of Spain, which was frowned upon by politicians scheming to join the royal family through marriage. When Margarita died of a mysterious illness at the age of 21, stories of her poisoning spread through the land. And while there is no way to track down every story, fact, or folklore that went into the creation of the Grimm brothers' Snow White, what we do know is at its heart is this eternal conflict between beauty and envy. And it is that very struggle that makes this tale so timeless. To begin to understand the tale of Rumpelstiltskin, let's take a look back at the nature of how fairy tales were told. For as long as folklore has existed, the storytelling has been attributed to women. It's where we get the saying, old wives' tale, or spinning a yarn. So strong was this link that the Brothers Grimm claimed that their stories came from the lips of women, and Charles Perrault even called his collection the Tales of Mother Goose. And in the time before these stories were collected, it was said that spinning tales and spinning yarn went hand in hand. So it's little surprise that the bones of Rumpelstiltskin first appeared in a tale about a spinner. The 7 Little Pork Rinds is the story of a lazy young woman who escaped punishment from her grandmother by telling a merchant that she ate more than her fill because of the miraculous amount of spinning she performed. Pressed by this lie, the merchant married her and expected that she would spin for him, but instead she spent her days in idle. When he discovered this and threatened her life, fairies appeared and transformed the linen into clothes, saving the girl. A folktale version that circulated in Germany begins very similar, but instead of fairies doing the magical spinning, 3 old decrepit spinsters arrived to do the work. And for their labor, all they wanted was an invitation to the young woman's wedding. When that day came and the groom set his eyes upon them, he was so shocked by their haggard appearance that he vowed his wife would never again work the spinning wheel. When it was time for the Brothers Grimm to begin work on their fairy tale, they had a different helper in mind. A diminutive creature that was willing to exchange his work for something living. And the additional story element that made the name of the tale truly unforgettable was that the young woman could keep her baby if she could only guess the dwarf's name. In almost every country that depended on spinning for yarn and for clothes, the name of the spinner, whether it's Rumpelstiltskin, or Tom Tit Tot, or Rick Don Rick Din, was known. Who could blame him for being drawn to the tale of a magical creature that could lift the burdens off their long, hard days? On the one hand, it is the story of a strong and intelligent heroine, and on the other, it's the story of the transformative power of love. Perhaps that's why Beauty and the Beast has been referred to as the most intellectually satisfying of all the fairy tales. To get to the heart of this story, we return to the Greek Isles and the legend of Zeus, the ruler of the gods, who was known to seduce beautiful maidens by transforming himself into creatures like the bull that Europa fell head over heels for. Then, in ancient Rome, we encounter the tale of Cupid and Psyche. Jealous of Psyche's renowned beauty, Venus demanded that her son Cupid shoot an arrow at Psyche so that she would fall in love with a hideous creature. When Cupid saw Psyche with his own eyes, he couldn't curse her, and eventually the two fell in love. But the lovers would be kept apart until Psyche embarked on a momentous journey that would take her through the fiery pits of Hades. These tales would enter into folklore and spawn various comedic and romantic variations, eventually finding themselves in the story that most resembles the one we know today. Madame du Beaumont's La Belle et la Bête. Du Beaumont's tale was intended for 12 to 18-year-old girls and featured a virtuous woman who spends her days educating herself with books and musical instruments, which was unusual for fairy tale maidens. And unlike most characters we encounter, Belle does not helplessly wait to be saved. In fact, she is the one that makes the heroic sacrifice to go to the Beast and save her family from ruin. Despite the tale's popularity, the Brothers Grimm chose not to include this story in their collection because it was well known as a French fairy tale. But they did include similar transformative stories such as The Frog Prince, The Singing Soaring Lark, and Snow White and Rose Red. And while these versions would achieve their own popularity, none of them would rival the romance and the majesty that stems from the love of Beauty and the Beast. Everyone knows the tale of Little Red Riding Hood, but how many of you know that its history extends back over thousands of years? To get to the root of this fairy tale, one has to travel back through time to ancient Greece, and to the myth of the Kronos, who attempted to devour his own children only to discover that in their place was a massive stone. From there, many of the elements we know best wouldn't appear until the 11th century, where we find a Belgian story about a young girl who was saved from a pack of wolves because she was wearing a red tunic she received on her baptismal day. And in the centuries that followed, the tale would evolve with each new retelling as it was heard across the globe. Sometimes the wolf was triumphant, but many times the girl outsmarted the group. Other times the creature wasn't a wolf at all, but an ogre or even a werewolf, which was a real fear for 16th century Europeans struck by terrible famines and haunted by stories of the werewolf trial of Peter Stump. It wasn't until the French godfather of fairy tales, Charles Perrault, published his collection, The Tales of Mother Goose, that the character was solidified into Little Red Riding Hood. Here, Red is a young lady tricked into giving out the location of her grandmother's house to the wolf. Upon her arrival, she climbs into bed with him and is swiftly devoured, with no happy ending in sight. Finally, over 100 years later, the version we all grew up with would emerge when Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm published Little Red Cap. The Grimm brothers put their stamp on the story by turning Red back into an adolescent and including an ending more appropriate for children. In their take, the hunter discovers the sleeping wolf and cuts him open to release the girl and her grandmother. And while the Grimm's fairy tale is the version children still hear today, countless others have appeared in books, movies, and television, all cleverly updating the tale for each generation. And despite all these variations, at the very core of every adaptation is the same fascinating story of an evil creature that preyed upon a little girl, and she was cloaked in a red riding hood. For thousands of years, mermaids have inspired the imagination of artists, lovesick sailors, and delighted children. But it was not until Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid that these creatures would appear in fairy tale form. The first mermaid legend circulated in ancient Assyria. It was a doomed love story about a goddess who fell in love with a mortal shepherd. After accidentally killing him, she jumped into the sea to take form as a fish, but the waters would not conceal her beauty, and from then on she took up the form of a mermaid. And over the next 2,000 years, tales of the sea maidens would remain popular. In some cultures, they were called water spirits, and in others, they were known as the sirens. It was not until 1811 that the foundation for Andersen's story would appear. The novella Undine is the story of a water spirit that gains an eternal soul by marrying a mortal. But when he discovers her true nature, he abandons her for another woman. And on the night that he remarries, Undine takes his life, knowing that they will be together in the next world. 25 years later, Hans Christian Andersen, a successful writer of children's tales and ballets, returned to the popular subject of mermaids for his new story. Combining elements of Undine and other mermaid tales, Andersen would weave his own feelings of dissatisfied romantic yearnings into the plot, creating an ending where the prince and the mermaid could never be together, but still find happiness. Not only would The Little Mermaid become his own personal favorite, it would also become his most prominent tale, even inspiring a statue to be put up in Copenhagen Harbor. Later, Walt Disney Animation would bring this tale to the big screen and update the ending to have the valiant prince save the mermaid and break the curse. But the true mark that the film would forever put on the tale was giving the mermaid the name that she will forever be associated with: Ariel.